Hi everyone, and welcome to the first tutorial for our repeating textures project. This is going to handle the grass, and as you can see right here, I have a grass texture on the ground. It may look like it's familiar, and that's because I'm inspired by a certain video game while creating this. It is very, very stylized. It doesn't look like something you'd see in the real world, almost like paint blobs here, and there's a reason for that. This is going off of something from, let's say, Zelda Skyward Sword, in which the art direction chose to do a more representative representation of grass blades rather than actual like singular pieces. You can see they kind of blur and they're fuzzy. There's a lot of reasons why you want to do something like that for grass. One of those reasons is that instead of making really, really deep textures on the objects, by doing something like this, you're no longer calling attention to the high detail of all the grass blades. You're calling attention to the characters and the scenery. So that's a good reason why you want to do that. You'll also notice when we look at some of these images that I was using for reference here, I'm not sure why my internet is taking forever to load these things. Let me load another one while we're talking there. You can see that some of these little textures, there isn't really any harsh contrast on there. It kind of all blends together. We have some nice golds and some greens and even some blues in there, but there isn't anything that's super shadow or hard edges on it. And that's actually very helpful for when we're making a repeating texture. As a matter of fact, in video games, repeating textures are very, very important because you can get a lot out of one texture in a lot of different places. You can see that in the wall right here. There's that same crack. There's that crack again. There's that crack, that crack, that crack, that crack. Now, this doesn't mean that the artists are being lazy. They're being smart. They're utilizing a system in which that they can keep texture sizes down to a minimum. And in video games, like we've already seen and talked about in class before, in video games, the 3D models aren't really the largest texture or the largest sizes that we have to deal with files as an artist, but it is actually these textures that can build up quite quickly in size. So instead of having it so we are literally painting every grass blade that Link has to walk around in here, we're actually taking repeating texture and cleverly adding that into the scene. Now in video games, there's also ways to paint in and overlay and do some really fun things with blending textures. We're not going to go super complicated in that area, but I wanted to give us a chance to look at how we can make representational textures of grass or something like that. So let's think about how we can do that. Let's look in Maya. So first thing I want you to notice here, this is a meadow valley or whatever that is. I have a fixed camera. You'll have that as well. You'll also be texturing a sky plane. So we have a ground and a sky. We're also going to put a dirt road in here as well. And that's going to be our project. For this first part, though, you'll notice I have my grass. And right now that looks pretty cool. If we were a character walking around from this level of walking, I could say, or this level that we're currently situated at with the camera, this actually looks pretty decent. But if I actually go into perspective and zoom out here, anyone that has played, I would say Fortnite or any other game where you can fly, you can sort of see that in Minecraft too. When you're actually playing a game, it's less evident to notice repeating textures when you're at the level that the game director or the art director has chosen these resolutions to be at. So if you're running around and Link is maybe going to be a character that's yay high and the camera is behind this person moving around, you're not really noticing that. Or even better, let's say that we'll make them smaller than that. So there we go. You're not really noticing these repeating textures. It's not that evident to you. But however, when you zoom out, that becomes very obvious. That's the same idea too when you are up close to bath tile or something like that. Those repeating textures aren't very obvious because you're looking at one tile at a time. But when you zoom out, you start to pick up certain little details and you start to sometimes even form images based on the tile's noise map or anything that's on there. Our eyes are trained to do that, and we can sort of have that evident right here, where right now I don't really notice these dark green spots that go across. But when I'm zoomed out, that's very, very obvious. Now, does that mean that the artists are lazy or anything like that? No, it just means that we need to be aware that when we repeat things in a texture, we have to try to make things feel like they don't repeat as best as possible. And one of those things that I did talk about earlier was that idea of not having tons of contrast in the scene and keeping a uniform color palette that seems to flow together is really, really helpful. So how do I even get repeating textures? I'm sure some of you have messed around and said, wait a minute, I don't even have the ability to do that. As a matter of fact, if I look at my Hypershade, let me fix this. When we first start working with a texture, it's going to load it in the 0 to 1. So in UVs, it's going to go from 0 to 1. And that's what this is doing right now. It's taking this texture, it's a 1024 by 1024 texture, and it's loading it in 0 to 1. There's ways to be able to make Maya change the way it's applying that texture in the Hypershade. And so if I graph this, and let me just call this grass material. If I graph this, so right click, graph network, there's my grass JPEG. It's going into the color. So that's the node connecting to here. And if I look at place 2D texture, if I look at this node right here, you'll notice that coverage is 1 to 1. So that's an interesting idea. What if I end up changing that? Let me move this over. Okay, so what if I change that? So if coverage is 0.5 to 0.5, you'll notice that's going halfway across both the X and the Y, or not, sorry, the U and the V. So if we even look in our UV editor, halfway across. Okay, let's go back to that place 2D node. Let's put that back to 1. We also have repeat. Let's try that. So if we put that at 4 by 4, there we go. We have a repeating texture. Now this is important. We need to be aware. So if I go back to camera 1, we need to be aware of how this will look when we play around in the camera. So when you're making a movie or you're making a video game, you need to be at the level of where the player is going to be looking from. If it's a top-down real-time strategy, we got to look at it from that angle of where the player's zoomed out at. Or if it's a first-person shooter, we should be in the first-person shooter's control when we're moving around inside the engine. So we shouldn't be thinking about it from just playing around in Maya. We should think about it from this end result, where that needs to be. So if I repeat that 8 by 8, look at this. This still looks pretty good. I think I'm going to leave it at 8 by 8 for now. But this is something I want you to be aware of. Okay, how do we make something like this? If I go into Photoshop, this is the file that I created. And we're going to create one of these from scratch right now. So what I'm going to do first is go to Create. And I'm going to make sure I do New. And I have a custom 1024 by 1024, 72. That's good. I don't need anything else. I don't want no artboard, so uncheck that. I don't need that right now. I'll hit Create. I'm going to close this one. Now I have this white project here. So, PSD file. Let's fix that. First thing I want to do, over in our color selection, we want some colors that are kind of springtime green or something that we could work with that is reminiscent of a forest greenery. So that's kind of what I did here. I have two different colors of green. I'm just going to go to Create or Filter. I'm going to use Render. And this time I'm going to go down to Clouds. You'll notice Clouds, it does this kind of really cool effect. And what's really neat about Clouds is it actually repeats itself. Once it goes to the edge of one side, it'll go over. I can prove that to you by going to Filter, Other, Offset. And if I tell this to go 512 by 512, what is that doing? It's going in moving it 512 pixels over and 512 pixels up. So that means that the edges of this, which were over here, got moved to the middle and got moved over to the midsection here. Easy way to be able to see that too, if we go into our show rulers, left click, whoops, okay, left click and drag down, it'll snap at that midsection. We'll do that one more time over here. So pull until it snaps to there. Okay, good. Now I have all of this. Oops, let me go back to there. Now I have this in the midsection. So I can again do a filter, other, offset, and I know for a fact that there are no seams on this thing. That's very helpful, and we're going to use that later on. Okay, now that I have that, I'm actually going to duplicate this layer. And what I want to do is I'm going to go into filter, render, and I'm going to go to fibers this time. And what I'm trying to do here is I don't want fibers that look stringy. I want to go to a variance that's super, super high. And I also want to get my strength so that way it kind of feels, I'm going to go down to maybe about a 1. So I have kind of this noise going on. If I hit OK, I've got something like this happening. Now that I have this happening, it gives me an ability to play around with some areas that I can have turn into like round blobs. So to be able to turn these into round blobs, if I go to filter, and then let's try here, pointillize. You'll notice pointillize is giving me these really cool, funky cells. And if I zoom out, that's how big those cells are going to be. I think that's okay. So the number's up to you. Obviously going something like this would be not a good idea. So I'm going to go maybe around 20 or between 20 and 30. So maybe 25. All right, now that I have this, this is where some fun can happen. I'm going to try to add a little bit more definition to this by going into filter. And let's try a oil paint. And with this allows me to kind of break up the squareness of it. So stylization, the cleanliness, you'll notice if I turn that up, some of those brush strokes are less evident. And you notice with scale, I can kind of get sort of this feeling of depth to the piece. So I'm going to go maybe around here. Again, don't feel you have to copy exactly my numbers. I'm looking for your aesthetic choices here and your use of creativity. So I have that going on. If I turn on and off lighting, you'll notice that you can kind of get a little bit of dimensionality to it, which is really, really interesting how we can get that to be in here. So I'm going to hit OK on this now. Not a lot, but it's just enough. I like that. Okay. Now that I have this, let's go into something like filter and blur. Let's try smart blur on this. And what smart blur is going to do is it's going to kind of blur out certain sections here. So let's try. You don't want to go too high. I kind of want some of this to blur out, other areas to stay the same. You notice if I turn edge only, it goes into some crazy modes here. Overlay edge is the same thing. So I'm actually going to keep this on normal. And let's bring that up to a medium. Hit OK. It may not even be all that noticeable. As a matter of fact, I think that worked against me. I'm going to do that one more time. Filter, blur, smart blur. And I'm going to drop that radius down. I think it took out a little too much of my detail. So I'm going to drop that threshold down too. What I'm trying to do is just kind of blur a little bit of this stuff out. I don't want it I don't want to lose all my details. That almost seemed like it did very little. I'm going to just apply smart blur one more time. All right, you know what? I think I'm going to stick with this. Now, what I'm going to do here is turn that one off and kind of look at this one underneath it. So I have this cloud, And I have this, which started as a cloud that turned into a fiber that then was pointillized, and then I had some oil paint applied to it. Lots of different steps, but I think I can make this a little bit better. Because as a matter of fact, if you look at my other one, it feels a little bit more subdued. And the reason why that's so subdued is because I have this... nope. I have this piece going on through a pass-through. Or, let's see. I have it set. Yeah, I think that was set to here. So this is set with an opacity on it, and there's some other settings. So I really want to kind of wash out some of this. This is a little too harsh. Again, too much contrast. So let's try here. I'm going to go to... Let's just cycle through these things. There's dissolve, darken. Multiply, interesting, but it's a little too dark for me. And we should get to something like a soft light. Pin light. Difference is crazy. And subtract. So, as you can see, there's a lot of different things that are happening to this when I cycle through my blending mode. What I'm going to do is use a couple of these. First thing I want to try is soft light. I like that it's kind of blurring out some of these pieces. Now, what I don't like is I'm losing a lot of definition on here. So I'm going to say we're going to keep that, but we're going to duplicate this layer. And now instead of soft light, let's try a saturation. And with saturation, I'm actually going to drop my opacity on this one down. Try and blend in with that other one. Okay. Now I'm going to duplicate that layer one more time. I'm going to bring it up to the top. And I'm going to put this on normal mode. But I'm going to drop my opacity quite a bit. What this is doing is just, it's bringing in some of those other colors. So there's that, and here's this. Let me push it a little bit further. So now I have this top layer, which has an opacity of about 33. I have a saturation, and then I also have a soft light. So all these things are blending and mixing in with each other to create this final piece. Now, this guy is in the background. It's not actually doing anything. It's kind of sitting there and having all these things blended under. It's sitting from underneath and having all these blended down on top of it. So I'm going to duplicate that layer. And I'm going to bring it over the top now. And let's try this as... And you'll notice it's just kind of bringing in a different effect over all these things. This one, which is just the clouds, if I drop that down now, it's giving me just a little bit of washing out of those high highs. So the contrast is kind of knocked back a little bit. So it blends a little bit more. Let's see what this does for my texture file. Save as. And I'm going to call that JPEG grass demo. Save it. All right, let's go back to Maya. And let me go to perspective so I can see this thing. And I'm going to open up the Hypershade. I'm going to take this and load in the grass demo texture. So now that I have this, I'm going to open it and close that. Huh. Well, there's a couple different things happening. One of the major things, let me go back to camera 1. You see it right here. That's not a seamless texture. Matter of fact, let's go. Oh, that's not a seamless texture right there either. You can see these spots where these lines where the texture repeats. As a matter of fact, you can even see some of these pieces are cutting off. How do we fix something like that? It's actually an easy thing now we can do in Photoshop. So how can we do this? I'm going to go into Photoshop, and I'm going to take all these layers, and right now I can't take that bottom layer. It's locked. I can either duplicate the layer or just unlock it. I'm just going to unlock it, and I'm going to hold down Shift, grab all these, and hit Control G, and that's going to give me a group. So now I have, let's call this grass layers, and I'm going to duplicate this layer. So I just duplicated the group, so duplicate group, and then now I'm going to take right click, merge group. What this did is it took that entire group and merged it into one piece. This is how we're going to use our overlay or our offset. So what I'm going to do is go to filter, other, and then offset. Now this has to be set to 512 by 512 because it is a 1024 by 1024 texture sheet. So if I hit OK, now those rulers, those lines are showing me where those seams are going to be. I'm going to hide those for a second. So if I go to View, Rulers, I can turn that off with Control R. And I meant to show guides. There we go. So let me go back to showing the rulers again and bring back guides. So Control R will also do that. And show guides is going to be Control and it's right here. Okay. So how do we get this to happen? So you can see, I think Control semicolon, you can get that to turn on and off for our guides. Let me get closer and then show you that right here. So there's the guide. Let's put it off. Lots of problems. I have a seam. How do we fix this seam? Well, let's first use this thing right here. If I hover over this, there's that awesome, did you murder someone in Photoshop? Just paint that blood out. This is our spot healing brush tool. If I click on this, and I need to make this large enough that it's going to make sense. If I sample too small, it's not going to really give me a good job at healing or getting rid of some of these seams. So what I'm going to do is go about this big and go from over here, hold down the Shift key, just left click and drag across. Now give it a couple seconds to think, and you'll notice it changed something. But in my opinion right now, it didn't actually change it to make it better. It kind of just blurred out a streak across the screen. This thing can work a lot better for you. Just hold down Shift and drag in small sections. You can sort of see that happening now. So do not ever use the spot healing brush just by holding down Shift and dragging in a massive long line, because it's just got too much to sample. Give it small little strokes to fix this. And again, I'm going to just do that from the top. And then sometimes it feels like spot healing brush just didn't want to work for me. So if I zoom out, this is when we can start to see those patterns occurring. I like to zoom out a lot and then see if I'm going to get a lot of patterns. What I'm starting to see is over here seems a little too much of a pattern, and over here seems a little bit weird. So what I'm going to do is go to this tool right here. And this is my clone stamp tool. Now, what I want to make sure I'm doing is sampling a large swath of pixels, or you're sampling a large brush. And I'm using a brush that uses 0% hardness. So I have it softened on the edges. And what I'm going to do is just go across. So I'm going to click maybe, or not go across, but I'm going to go and use my stamp healing tool and hold down Alt. You'll notice it's going to be crosshairs. So if I click maybe over here, so just Alt and left click, and then just click there. And then I'm going to Alt, left click here. This isn't a sample from over here. I'm going to paint there. So what this is doing is grabbing sections and sampling them. And you want to do that in different sections so it doesn't feel like it's exactly the same piece that you're sampling over and over again. So I'm holding on Alt, and then I'm just left clicking. Alt, and then left click somewhere else. Hold down Alt, left click, and then just left click somewhere else. So this is how we can break up some of those. There's some spots that Photoshop didn't even make unnatural, or they didn't. It's not a mistake, but you can see some of these lines that are coming across just because our eyes naturally try to find meaning in imagery. And I can see a line here and sort of a line right there. So I'm going to get rid of that just by, again, using that clone stamp tool. And then Alt and left click, and then just sample. Alt and left click to click there, and then just left click. And you'll notice as I drag, sampling from another area there. So there we go. I've got a repeating texture, and let's make sure it repeats. Let's go to Filter, and let's do another offset. So we're just gonna perform an offset. I know that it's a 512 by 512 offset because that's what it was last time we had it set. So there we go. Let's go to File, Save As, and let's go to a JPEG and Grass Demo. And let's see what the heck that is. Now don't name that Grass Demo because that's me putting demo. That would be your last name, Grass. Okay, I don't see it anymore. That repeating issue, or the seams are gone. So that's how we paint out seams in Photoshop, and we add a repeating texture to it. So that's the first video of this series for our repeating textures. Next, we'll be looking at adding some bald patches or some dirt or some other type of flowers that might pop up. And then finally, we'll go into creating our sky. And we also have our road.